Hi everybody, my name is Vlad. In this video we will talk about why Putin hates Ukrainians so much. On my channel I talk about Russia, Ukraine and current circumstances, and watch this video to the end. I will answer all questions. As for me and for all normal people, none of these reasons could be considered justification for what is happening now. It's impossible to get in the head of this guy, but we were trying to look at that from his side. So the first reason is a separate national identity. For many years, the Kremlin has been widely believed that Ukrainian people do not exist, that the same Russian people with a similar history, culture and language lived in Ukraine. Some even do not consider Ukrainian language to be separate. And Vladimir Putin shares a similar opinion, published a separate article on this subject last year, where he talked about the historical context of Ukraine in Russian history and calls Russians and Ukrainians one people. Born out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine began to actively engage in its national identity, which isolated Ukrainians from Russian culture and outlined the separate path for people. At 2014, these processes intensified at times. After the annexion of Crimea and the war in Donbass, the Russian began to be perceived as hostile, and Ukrainian identity is gaining with popularity on the territory of Ukraine, even in traditionally pro-Russian regions. Putin considers the emergence of such national identity unacceptable, and the war that has been started is largely unleashed with the aim of eliminating such an identity. That is already beginning to be observed in the occupied territories. Dissenters are suppressed or kidnapped. At the same time, the Ukrainization of territories is taking place. Education institutions promise to conduct training only in Russian, and Ukrainian signs and street names are being removed in occupied cities. The next reason is separation of Russia and another way of development of Ukraine. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, 15 new independent republics appeared in its place. However, many of them remain closely connected with each other, both economically and culturally. Russia and Ukraine in turn remained one of the closest countries. The union of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus was regarded as the key of the entire post-Soviet space because of Slavic roots and common history. However, since the beginning of 2000s, Ukraine, like many post-socialist countries, has been striving towards Western Europe with its liberal democratic values. The collapse of the Soviet Union showed that the socialist model of development turned out to be very complex, and the Western one was one of the most stable and successful. It became especially obvious for citizens after the fall of the Iron Curtain, when residents of post-Soviet countries were able to learn or visit Western countries, and their goods appeared in the post-Soviet regions. This is why many former socialist countries began to strive to the West and integrate into Western institutions like NATO or the European Union. The first Ukrainian attempts to turn to the side of West took place under Yushchenko, and the Kremlin reaction even then was quite hostile. And after the Maidan, the reaction ended with direct aggression with the annexion of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. In many ways, the problem was that Russia, for 30 years of its independence, on the one hand abandoned the pro-Western course in its pure form, on the other hand could not offer any attractive ideological alternative. The Kremlin theses largely refer only to the past and do not give a clear vision of the future. This is why Russia has not been able to maintain its zone of influence even within the post-Soviet space. And then Putin decided an open confrontation with Ukraine, since he could not use soft power to persuade the Ukrainian people to side Russia. Also, there were all the possibilities for this. The third reason is the democratization of Ukrainian society. With the collapse of the post-Soviet Union, many post-Soviet countries have followed the path of habitual authoritarianism. These are Belarus, Russia, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. However, the opposite effect has occurred in Ukrainian society. The Soviet government, on the contrary, became an inoculation against authoritarian power, because the change of power in Ukraine occurred with inviolable regularity. If in Ukraine 2000s were accompanied by a struggle for power with a regular protest, then in Russia the opposite processes took place, building an authoritarian society. In 2010, the difference between two sides became more and more obvious and reached its culmination just before the start of the war. There were also concerns about the creation of a more successful government in the neighborhood, which threatened the Putin's regime. The war in Donbass, one of the most developed regions of Ukraine at that time, began partly because of this fear. Putin, like many Soviet people, sincerely believes that an authoritarian course or even a complete dictatorship is many times better than a democratic regime with a change of powers. In such a paradigm, it becomes clear this is literally a confrontation between two opposing systems, whereas the Ukrainian people simply do not accept authoritarianism. The fourth reason is the decommunization of Ukraine, which Putin openly spoke about just before attack on Ukraine. Putin said that Lenin created Ukraine, but in turn ungrateful Ukrainians only demolish his monuments. As well as the direct threats were heard towards Ukraine. Putin's boredom of the Soviet Union is quite an important component of his worldview. He repeatedly stated that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and almost all statements concerning the Union are pronounced in a relatively positive and nostalgic way. In general, for Putin and as well as for his generation in general, love for the Soviet Union is quite characteristic. And in turn, anti-communist views have always been widespread in Ukraine than in Russia. And since the 2014, the process of decommunization has begun throughout the country. This mainly affected the renaming of geographical objects and the demolition of monuments. The Russian government has always been sensitive to this, and Putin has repeatedly made threats about it. It also worth to note that in the occupied territories, the Russian authorities are right now restoring the monuments to Lenin and even hanging red flags. The fifth reason is preventing Putin from recreating the Soviet Union or the former empire. Imperialistic views are quite common in the Kremlin, and Putin is also an adherent of such narrative. When Putin came to the power, he set himself the goal of keeping the post-Soviet countries in the orbit of the Kremlin's influence. But as mentioned above, this could not be done without an attractive ideological concept. This is why in 30 years Russia has lost its influence in many countries, including Ukraine. In general, Russia always regarded the lands of Ukraine as its own, and Ukrainians either as one people or as a younger brother. Based on this understanding of affairs, Putin has always considered Ukraine to be the ancestral lands, initially of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian people openly began to hint the return of Ukraine to the sphere of Russian influence, which caused Putin's rejection outgrowing to such hatred that he decided to start a full-fledged war. Weak soft power did not allow Russia to maintain its influence in Ukraine peacefully. Therefore, the main, straightforward, and the most destructive path of the war was chosen. Summing up, it was saying that Putin's hatred of Ukrainians comes largely from the fact that Ukrainian people did not accept his picture of the world. Ukrainians have become a separate people for Russians and have gained their own identity. Ukraine has begun to move out of the sphere of influence of Russia and is driving to the west.